What's up? Back for another update. This is Ground Zero Salem, and I'm Pat. We're listening to Born Against, the rebel sound of shit and failure. This is a compilation of various 7 inches compilation appearances from this great New Jersey hardcore band. Political stuff from early to mid-90s was the era they existed. I figured this would be apropos enough because I'm going to talk about the years of 1997 and 98. I decided to kind of mash them together because they're kind of a blur for me. It was an interesting couple of years. 1997, I moved from Syracuse, New York to Rochester, New York. After visiting there for a while, I lived with some friends of my parents and took my first attempt at going to college, which didn't quite pan out, going to community college. I went back at like age 31 to pursue the career I'm in now, but it was a turbulent time. Rochester was kind of a scary, violent place. I used to go home every weekend to visit my girlfriend at the time in Syracuse, take the Greyhound. And it seemed like every weekend I decided to stay in Rochester, something bad happened. Either some dude tried to mug me with a screwdriver, me and my friends got shot at once, fights, violence. It was a rough town and a rough time then. So I lived in Rochester for pretty much all of 1997. Then in 1998 I moved back to Syracuse and promptly hated my life and where I was stuck at in my hometown. Tried to figure some stuff out. Went cross-country with a friend of mine, visited a bunch of cities, landed in Boston, and fell in love with it, and then I moved here. I moved back to Syracuse eventually, but I ended up back here. Long story short, Rochester was fucking wild. One of the reasons I moved there was I was getting more and more into kind of the underground side of punk. I was starting to transition into getting to Crust and stuff like that. I'd been going down to Albany for shows pretty frequently. My summer home from school, when I was back in Syracuse, the Greyhound station was like a 10-minute walk from where I was living in the university area. So almost every weekend I was going down to Albany to see shows at the QE2, see punk bands play, and just generally checking stuff out. So when I moved to Rochester, a lot of the time I was hanging out with my friends. There was a punk house where everybody kind of congregated, and it was this really interesting shift in everybody's music tastes for whatever reason. When I first moved there, everybody was into the staple stuff, you know, MDC, Chaos UK, The Exploited, DOA, kind of standard hardcore punk and street punk kind of stuff. And then this kind of collective consciousness started leaning more towards stuff on Profane Existence records, started leaning more towards Crust, and it was kind of funny because anything that was punk but was a little bit more aggressive or wasn't like the straight up 3-chord stuff ended up getting called Crust. I remember a joke where my friends and I were sitting around talking, we're like, what's the difference between Crust, grindcore, and Powerviolence? Well, grindcore is guys with long hair, Crust are dirty punk rockers, and Powerviolence are skater dudes. Essentially the music's the same, which of course is not true at all once you pay a little bit more attention to the nuances in the music. But at the time we were just like, yeah, you know, Crust, it's this new thing that we're all getting into. Most of us didn't know that it had existed since the late 80s. It had been around for almost 10 years at that point. But I was kind of shaking off the bug I'd been bitten by for, you know, really simplistic 3-chord punk after being burned out on metal and metallic hardcore for a couple of years before that. So it was kind of my way of me finding my way back to like metallic stuff at the time. So a bunch of the records I was into, I go down these trips down memory lane, man, and like I'm like, oh yeah, I'll pick out like 5 records that are, you know, influential to me at the time, or I have the like strong memories around, and then I end up pulling like 20. And that's what I did with this, so I'll try to keep it short for each one. Ton of 7 inches that I ended up pulling. I mentioned Profane Existence a minute ago, and that's where like the big epicenter was for like a lot of this style of punk back then. It was Minneapolis, Profane Existence Records. Pittsburgh was another big town for that stuff. Around the same time and a little bit later. This was a classic 7-inch. This is the Civil Disobedience 7-inch in a few hours of madness. Really cool, technically adept, kind of, I guess you would call it kind of crusty punk. It's more aggressive, slightly metallic, but it's also got like almost kind of weird off-time, almost ska-ish parts. Very talented band. This happened to come out on red vinyl. This is a great single. Their LP that came afterwards is good, but nowhere near as good as the 7-inch. Kind of tongue-in-cheek. There's all kinds of that fun cut and paste sort of thing with the layout. And another big one was Ass Rash. This was like basically the starter pack for little crusties back then, along with Doom and Disrupt. Ass Rash were fucking awesome. Very fucking chaotic. Intoxicating. Aggressive punk that with a metallic edge. Kind of shouted, slurred vocal style. Really hoarse, raspy vocals. Kind of pogo punkish kind of songs, but with the skeletons but the meat on the bones is grisly fucking metallic madness. Fucking awesome record. And again, much like Civil D, they put out an LP a few years after this that was good, but a lot more cleaned up, a lot more straightforward punk rock, and I didn't care for it as much. But Save for Your Doomed Future on Profane Existence Records, fucking love this record. Sometime in there in 97, 98, I put in an order at through a distro in Florida that I think I've mentioned a bunch of times, the Sound Idea distro. That was a store in Brandon, Florida, just outside of Tampa. This guy, Bob Surin, ran the joint, and back then I think I got my first tax return that was like $100+ and spent it all on records because I was just discovering all this new, aggressive, hardcore punk that was almost metal but not quite, and kind of falling in love with it. And I ordered a bunch of stuff, a lot of which is in this pile. And I got into Asshole Parade, and I would say along with Black Army Jacket, this is the beginning of that sound, that Powerviolence sound from California spreading to other places other than California. A lot of the token signatures of the original wave of Powerviolence is kind of contained in here. The slow, fast, slow kind of thing, really short songs. Fucking really great record here. There's wearing their influences on their sleeves. They cover Infest and Citizen's Arrest. They did a split LP with a band called Palatka after this that's just as good. Very cool band, like strained, snotty, kind of hard to describe, kind of very venomous fucking vocal style. And Asshole Parade was from Florida. I think they were from Gainesville, if I'm not mistaken, where I lived years later. They were long gone by then. Filth. I mean, Filth were an incredible band. This came out on Lookout Records, which is odd because Lookout's kind of known for pop punk stuff. You know, they were part of the same scene essentially as a lot of bands, which is weird to think. Somebody told me the first time they saw Neurosis when they were still a gloomy hardcore punk, almost kind of crusty band, Neurosis was touring with Green Day, you know, so things changed later, but they were all kind of in the same scene at one point or another. But Filth is tortured, fucked up punk rock. They did another record that was a split with a band called Blatz. That's also excellent, with this completely shredded vocal style. The voice box is just hanging out of Jake Filth's fucking throat on this. It's also a classic record that I fucking love. And of course, I didn't own this back in the day. I had I think a bootleg discography that I got from that Sound Idea order, but this is the Infest self-titled 7-inch. It was the first time I've ever heard this legendary band, and it blew my fucking mind. Just how scattershot the rhythmic approach was. The vocal style was like nothing I'd ever heard. This sort of like weird, almost cartoonish barking, shouting sort of thing that just somehow really worked really well for the music. There's a million imitators of Infest, and none of them could even hold a sliver of a fraction of a fucking candle to these greats. Then we got the Acrid Bombs of Death split. Acrid were from California, or no, Acrid, sorry, were from Canada. Bombs of Death were from California. Bombs of Death was a short-lived side project with Max, the drummer from Spaz. Very almost straight-up thrash metal, but way fast, like intense Infest almost speed, but thrash metal music. Acrid were more of like a slower death grind kind of band with some contemporary hardcore influences in there. They also are on a split that I'll be showing off later in the update that I have pulled. But this came out on No Idea. It's on Gray Marble. It's also got this this nice die cut 7-inch cover, which is neat. This I picked up around that same time. I think I bought this at Crypto Comics in Albany when I was going to a lot of shows down there. But this is a Negative Approach tribute, Reproach, that features Drop Dead, Man is the Bastard, Spaz, some band called Cops for Christ that I've never heard of aside from this record, Voorhees, who I love, Union of Uranus, Chokehold, and Rupture from Australia. Fucking great comp. I was a huge Negative Approach fan then, and I still am. Not much to say about Disrupt that I haven't already said. I was just listening to a ton of their stuff. This is the split with War Collapse. Great shit there. I talked about Disrupt last time, so I won't go too into depth. I didn't own this back in the day, but again, I had a discography called Fuck Peaceville that I no longer have, but it's fucking doom. You know, Discharge style music with more of a death metal kind of execution, growled vocals, great fucking band. You know, we used to joke they only existed on like Krusty's pants, because every fucking Crust punk had at least one Doom patch and one Amoebix patch, like on their butt flaps or whatever, and their notoriety was for a reason. They were fucking great. This is a band, Kill the Man Who Questions, from Philly, that used to play Syracuse pretty regularly. My old Dungeons & Dragons themed hardcore band, Gygax, our only show we opened for them. They were cool, really political, male and female vocal led hardcore band that had a lot of different types of things going on. They had some speed and intensity that leaned more towards Powerviolence or Crust or something like that, but they also had kind of these discordant off-time sort of screamy parts that were similar to a lot of the bands on Ebullition. You know, what's called Scrams now, which is like the most annoying made-up genre name, but you can't call it Screamo anymore, thanks to everything that happened in the 2000s. Yeah, really kind of all over the place, discordant, but also fast, political hardcore. And Hatebreed Under the Knife. Say what you will, I like Hatebreed. I like their first couple of records, and I definitely love the Under the Knife 7-inch, and I didn't like a lot of hardcore like this at the time. My friend Chuck from Syracuse, I think, taped this for me along with their demo or something like that. They also had one of their earlier records was a split with a band called Neglect from New York, and it was just, this is not like the stuff after it, at least in terms of recording. It's really filthy, and it was so much faster than hardcore of this style that was happening at the time. You know, a lot of the New York hardcore, straight edge hardcore, for lack of a better term, quote unquote, tough guy hardcore, was very repetitive, riding the E, chugging, dive bomb kind of laden stuff. And this kind of brought it back to fast 4/4 beats, that kind of more youth crew tempo a lot, like between the slow mosh parts that kind of made the slower, heavier parts more impactful, which I think is a big ingredient to their success, because it appealed to, you know, dudes into bands like Sepultura at the time, as well as kids into hardcore. And this is Under the Knife, Kill an Addict, Smash Your Enemies, Filth, just pure fucking rage. Look at Jamie jumping on the back there. Look at him go. Fucking love this record. This I had a dub of, and most of the time I've seen it on LP, but this is a 2 7-inch version of Another Religion, Another War by the Verukers. Great, straightforward, classic UK hardcore punk. A lot of similarities to Discharge, a little bit brighter in a way, not exactly positive. All these songs are about nuclear war and Condemned to Death, Seek Shelter in Hell, Deadly Games. It's all basically war-based stuff, but I just mean brighter in sound, maybe a little less gloomy, a little bit more like pogo kind of stuff. My favorite song by them is not on here, which is a song called Soldier Boy, which is one of their earlier tracks from one of their singles, but straight up nonstop blitzkrieg of Mohican punk on that. This is a record I listened to into the fucking ground that nobody that I know talks about really, and that's By the Throat. This was an Albany band that was a side project between the members of Devoid of Faith, who I've talked about a fair amount and I like a lot, and Monster X, who are a straight-edge grindcore band, also from Albany. So it's, I think his name is John, the vocalist from Monster X, with some of the guys from Devoid of Faith and maybe another random dude or two. Not totally sure on the lineup. Nate Wilson, who was in Devoid of Faith and a ton of other bands, played guitar in this, I think. Member bullshit aside, this is fucking angry, fast hardcore with completely monstrous grind vocals. Not like a full frontal assault of like blast beat laden grind. It's more fast hardcore punk, like if you could imagine like Negative Approach or Agnostic Front, but like with way thicker guitars and a monstrous fucking death metal vocalist. You'd be getting close to what this sounds like. It's really fucking good. I love that record. I got into Christ on Parade a lot. There's something about the California bands, particularly the darker hardcore bands from Oakland, from Berkeley, that area. Filth is no exception. Early Neurosis, when they were still kind of more or less a hardcore band. Grimple, which I should have pulled that record, but I didn't. The Grimple split with Logical Nonsense should be in this pile. Also great. Christ on Parade is along those lines. They're not quite as metal as all the aforementioned. Not quite as heavy. A little bit more of a straightforward kind of thing, but they aesthetically and lyrically, and certain parts of just their music, like how their bass sounds and stuff, the bass tone and other elements, they're very, very dark, very gloomy. Again, I had a bootleg discography. Years later, after the discography got scratched to shit, I went and tracked down individual pieces of vinyl. It's a common theme with me. This was in that order from Sound Idea Records. This was my first encounter with Anti-Semex. Still is the only one I own by them. I need to get those later records. I've listened to them, Scandinavian Jawbreaker and the other ones, but this is their earliest rawest material. I mean, it's appropriate enough. It's Victims of a Bomb Raid. It's 2 EPs, Raped Ass and Victims of a Bomb Raid. And it sounds like a bomb going off, you know. It has a certain blistering, fast discharge thing, like every band of that era that played this within this realm of punk, you know, couldn't help but be influenced by Discharge, but there's a little bit more of a slower, just punishing kind of element to it when they do slow it down. I was still listening to Integrity a lot. I believe Systems Overload came out around that time. It was between 96 and 98. That's still my favorite record by them. This is a collection of earlier singles and splits and odds and ends. Den of Iniquity. It's just 10 songs, but it's like some of their different kind of approaches. The songs from the split with Mayday are a little bit more dirgy and almost kind of death metal, less Youth Crew or hardcore punk. I really like those songs. Kingdom of Heaven, Darkness, 18 Wheels. It's also got their earliest 7-inch before they were still metal, like from the get-go, really, but a little bit more on the Youth Crew side and a little less thrash metal at that period. This came out on their own imprint, Dark Empire. Great CD. They've had so many compilations of their odds and ends. I have a version of this on double vinyl, and it's like some of these songs, most of these songs, 1 or 2 aren't on it, and then there's other stuff. It's all very cryptic, you know, which is par for the course for Dwid. I've had this on LP. I wish this had the LP art, or I had the original LP, because this is god-awful looking cover art, but this is the Cripple Bastards from Italy. On the punker side of grind, definitely grind. Pretty lo-fi, lots of songs, 69 songs. This was re-released by Crimes Against Humanity. I think this is the first full-length by these Italian guys, if I'm not mistaken. I know they got heavier and got better production and started kind of playing more in the metal realm. But at least when I discovered them, they were almost kind of like from a DIY punk kind of base. I also got a split 10-inch with them in a band called Patarini, which was really raw. Both bands were pretty lo-fi and great. This record's perfect, though. There's plenty of blazing grind, but they throw in weird elements of other genres in there here and there, and it keeps it nice and interesting. Capitalist Casualties. This is the original CD that I bought back then. Just fast punk. It's very heavily influenced by the first couple of DRI records before they crossed over. Fucking great stuff. They were part of the whole original crew of Powerviolence bands with Men as Bastard and Infest and all that stuff, but they were a little bit more straightforward. There was a little less jarring transitions between slow and fast. A lot of it was like mostly no slow, all go, if you know what I mean. And they were a lot more like kind of political than a lot of those bands. There's a lot of more leftist political commentary on their songs. Their singer just passed away this year, and that's a damn shame. They were a great fucking band. And when I was living in Rochester, as I mentioned, I was coming back around to heavier stuff. I think I was just getting bored with, you know, simplistic punk rock and that being the only thing I was listening to. So this was kind of my way of finding my way back to metal. And at this period, you know, 20 years ago, nobody wanted records. You know, they were strictly an underground thing. As I'd mentioned before, I think I bought a lot of records because it was my only way to get a hold of certain bands. Like all those records that I just showed off, those 7-inches, most of them didn't come out on CD or weren't available on cassette, which were my two preferred formats at the time. Over the years, you know, I've warmed up more to vinyl, and I even went through a period where I was like a vinyl elitist or whatever, maybe got over that like 6 years ago when everything became too expensive, and I realized most new vinyl releases were just not even created for vinyl. It was essentially a giant CD, you know. Very few things are recorded analog now, so what's the point of paying $20 more just to throw my 2 cents in on the whole format discussion that's been floating around? Anyway, I digress. I was getting back into metal, so I bought a couple of compilations. This is a classic one. I finally got the sequel to this when I went out to Seattle and hung out with Eric, but this was the original, and it's got DRI on it, Beyond Possession, great Canadian band, The Mentors, The Insolents, who I remember nothing about, Corrosion of Conformity, Lost for Words, one of their best tunes, this band Depression from Australia, who are a great fucking hardcore band. This song Endless Armies fucking rules. Ugly Americans, who were North Carolina, I think, hardcore band, whose singer went on to sing for Corrosion of Conformity for a little bit. But yeah, great little sampler there, Death Records. The other one that I got at the time, this is a piece of work right here. This is a real jewel. Speed metal. It's like, album art looks like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon. I love this guy. Why is there an eel? Like, what's speed metal about an eel? I don't know. Anyway, love the cover art. Awesome sampler. You know, nothing that isn't... there's nothing exclusive on this, but we have Slayer, Evil Has No Boundaries, Hallows Eve, Metal Merchants, Hyrax, Lightning and Thunder, Voivod, Omen, Termination, Celtic Frost, Visual Aggression, Destruction, Invincible Force, Sodom, Blasphemer, Bloodlust, Tear It Up, and Cryptic Slaughter with Low Life. It drove me crazy because this Cryptic Slaughter song is so good. One of their best tunes. And I couldn't find anything by them anywhere at the time. You know, downloading hadn't really come along yet. Their records were like impossible to find. As soon as eBay got big, 2 or 3 years later, the first thing I bought was Convicted by Cryptic Slaughter, which to this day is one of my favorite records. It was around this time that I was really falling in love with the idea of crossover, you know, this marriage of old hardcore punk and thrash metal. You know, it had everything that I wanted, and I became kind of obsessed with it for a while. This is years before Municipal Waste blew up and all that sort of stuff that followed, which after a while kind of, in my opinion, sort of wore out its welcome. And, you know, I got kind of sick of it for a little bit. I'm kind of over all that now, you know. I still like the first Municipal Waste record. I don't care. Anyway, I also really, really got into The Accused. One thing I noticed with all these Crust bands, particularly Ass Rash, Filth, and Grimple, they had this really sandpapery, screechy vocal style that I really, really liked. And I'd heard The Accused at parties. Some of the older dudes that I hung out with were really into them, you know, that I hung out with in Syracuse. These guys that were in like thrash bands and stuff in the late 80s that were like pushing 30 when I was a teenager that I used to party with. But they would always play The Accused and Broken Bones and great old bands like that. And I remember thinking to myself, man, the Accused, I need to get some of their stuff. And luckily enough for me, the Record Archive in Rochester, New York had all this stuff for pennies on the dollar, you know. This is still my copy that I bought back then. Showed it off before, but just incomparable crossover thrash. Just sloppy enough to have that sort of frenetic urgency to it. But like killer razor sharp fucking riffs, barfing, screeching vocals courtesy of Blaine Fart, one of my favorite vocalists of all time. Awesome fucking record. This one tightens it up. There's a little bit more palm muting and gallop to it. So it's got more of like almost kind of like a, I don't know, Bonded by Blood, Exodus kind of feel, or like early Megadeth or Metallica, but it's still very like fucking Discharge, Black Flag, fucking punk kind of thing going on. This is more fun than an Open Casket Funeral. If I failed to mention it, which I believe I did, this is the return of Martha Splatterhead. Yeah, one of my favorite bands of all time. Big influence on a lot of stuff that came later. Cannibal Corpse in particular. A bunch of other bands. I also really liked Dehumanization by Crucifix. Yet another dub that I had that years later I tracked down on eBay for kind of a lot of money at the time. I think it got a repress at some point, but this is an original pressing on Corpus Christi Records, which I think had something to do with the band Crass. But this folds out into a huge poster. Kind of slurry, shouted kind of vocal style. Not too different from Roger Murray from Agnostic Front, who they were friends with. I'm not sure who was influencing who. I've heard stories that like after AF played with Crucifix, they kind of took more the vocal style. I don't know if that's true or not. Hearsay and conjecture. But regardless, you know, they, along with Final Conflict, who I mentioned last update, and a few other bands, I guess Battalion of Saints, they were an American band that seemed to take as many cues from what was going on in England with the 82 street punk and Discharge and that kind of stuff, as well as American hardcore. They were from California, I think LA, pretty sure. You know, they had that stark black and white, crasshole kind of political thing going on aesthetically, but they were a raging hardcore band, and they were also fucking great. And this is the best thing they did. They didn't do too much else in this. I think they did a 7-inch and one other recording. That's when they really honed their shit. And then finally in this pile, I have the Acrid Left for Dead Buzzsaw split. You know, you can't go wrong with a Buzzsaw record. You just can't. Left for Dead were a fucking revelation to me about how good hardcore could be. The combination of influences was pretty unique for the time. I've listened to interviews with the singer, Chris Callahan, talking about what they were listening to. And, I mean, these guys were mostly, you know, clean cut, I think mostly straight edge dudes from Hamilton, Ontario, that were getting into Powerviolence, some of the more metallic hardcore coming out at the time, and a bunch of other stuff. And it's just this brutal, stripped down, pissed record that is rife with fast parts going into punishing breakdowns, but it's not cheap. You know, it's not fucking pit fodder. It's not crowd pandering. It's just this really well executed vocalization of anger. A lot of socially aware kind of lyrics. A lot of lyrics lashing out against people. I think I've mentioned before, one of my favorite lyrics of all time is "Fuck your popularity contest. I want to see a murder contest." A song called "Who Do You Know," which you know, I can't think of anything more succinct than that. Yeah, I mean, Callahan's always been a fantastic lyricist, and I've followed pretty much everything he's done. This was, I believe, his first thing. There's some aspects of it that remind me of Chokehold, the straight edge kind of chugga chugga mosh political band. The slow parts kind of remind me of that, but the fast parts go almost into Infest territory or something along those lines. It's really good. And then Acrid, who I mentioned before, that are on that split with Bombs of Death. Very good, like I mentioned, kind of slow-mo grind with a little bit noisy hardcore kind of influence going on. They're a band that I didn't appreciate much. I only listened to the Left 4 Dead side of this. You know, it was kind of like the Void Faith split, where the Faith side of that didn't really click with me for quite a while. But eventually, Acrid really, as the years went by, especially when I started getting more back into brutal, heavy, detuned stuff, they started to click for me a lot. They're quite good. They have a pretty lengthy discography. Not obscenely so, but they have a couple of LPs besides this and some splits and stuff, so worth checking out. Some of their stuff should get reissued, I think. So anyhow, that's my story for the years of 97 and 98. Now that we've caught up to 20 years ago, I don't know if I'm going to continue this. These were like the years of my life that I kind of formed my tastes, really. And one really sad realization, I have all these records and CDs and tapes behind me. My taste in music kind of stops evolving past this period. I mean, a little bit further on, there was some stuff that came out up to like the early 2000s that I liked. Probably like 2001, that was pushing the boundaries and new for its time, like a evolution in musical style for whatever genre it was. But I realized, like, most of the music I listen to is aping something from up to that era. So I don't really know if I'm gonna do what I was listening to in like 2000, 2001. Everything I was into in 2000, 2001 were hardcore bands that were very successfully sounding like bands from the 80s. So what's the point? I don't know. As great as Tear It Up and Nine Shocks Terror were, I don't know if I'm really going to go into that, but that's a ramble. This is run fucking long. I'm going to finish this delicious Diet Coke. Try to get a sponsorship, Ginger Lime. Check that shit out. All right, that's enough.